you're ready.
Sure. I've started the recording as well from my end here. So there's still a couple of people joining, but I'm going to get started now. So it's great to see so many people who are here and joining us, people that are already here. So I want to wish everyone a good evening and thank you for joining us. My name is Will Smith and I'm the president of LivPsych, Liverpool's Student Psychiatry Society, and a fourth year medical student at the University of Liverpool. I'm excited to share with you all the first webinar of our Racism Mental Health, How to Be an Anti-Racist Mental Health Researcher series at Decolonising Psychiatric Research, an Agenda for Change. In June 2020, we hosted our first online event, Racism Mental Health, where we invited speakers Alison Faulkner, Harry Sewell, and Professor Suman Fernando to share their thoughts and ideas of how institutional racism manifests in mental health services. From what was said, it was clear that the issues at hand remain vast and that much needs to be done to correct these issues and take steps towards equality. The conversation specifically raised a plethora of issues which exist within mental health research, the body of work and evidence which informs and underpins all of practice. This research then feeds back into systems of practice and further inquiry, perpetuating a seemingly unbreakable cycle. To penetrate deeply entrenched racism within mental health, it's clear that tackling racism within research is paramount. For this new series of events, we've partnered with the McPin Foundation and the Mental Health to bring you a talk a month focusing on tackling racism in mental health research. The series will culminate in a large-scale discussion in June 2021, 1 year on from our initial event, to discuss progress and directions for the future. We hope that the series will not only serve as primarily informative, but also as an open space to ask questions, challenge our ideas, and collaborate on creating achievable and sustainable goals. This evening, we welcome back Professor Suman Fernando for his talk, Decolonising Psychiatric Research, an Agenda for Change. After Professor Fernando's presentation, we will invite responses and reflections from Huma Andley and Grace Lucas, before we'll invite you all to join the discussion with questions and comments. At the end, Vanessa Pinhold, who has helped us to organise this event, but is also co-founder of the McPin Foundation, will provide a response from the perspective of the charity. Just to make you all aware, this evening's event is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. The recording will be made available afterwards to watch and share after the event has finished. I would also ask you to keep yourselves on mute while the presentations are going on. If you would like to speak or ask a question, and please write a comment in the chat. Likewise, if you prefer to send your question directly without sharing it with others, please send a question to myself and William Smith in the participants. Please indicate to us if there's a question you would like to ask in person with your mic and camera on, and we'll make every effort to ask all of your questions today. But if for some reason we don't get round to asking your question, we can email your question or comment to any of our panel to answer after the event. The chat logs will be retained after the meeting, and all questions will be collated for the final discussion in June this summer. You can also tweet during or after the event today with the hashtag anti-racist MHResearch. If you're watching via the live stream and there's a question you'd like to ask, you can either add a comment to YouTube or tweet your question with the hashtag anti-racist MHResearch, and we will ask it for you. Please note there is a short time delay between the Zoom meeting and the live stream, so your question may take a short time to be seen and answered. So without further delay, I want to welcome our speaker, Professor Suman Fernando.
Yeah, shall I share the screen then?
Yeah, Suman, whilst you go ahead and share your screen, I'm going to introduce you to everyone here.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, that's great. If you put it on presentation, then we should be able to see that. So, formerly a consultant psychiatrist in Enfield for over 20 years, Suman is now Emeritus Professor of Social Sciences in the School of Social Sciences at the London Metropolitan University. In the past, Suman has been involved in developing third sector services in London and Toronto, and in supporting non-governmental organisations in Sri Lanka. More recently, he was consultant to a 4-year research capacity building program in Sri Lanka that was overseen by the Transcultural Psychiatry section at McGill University in Montreal. Suman has noted his critical approach to Western psychiatry and psychology from a transcultural perspective, and his writing on how institutional racism is embedded in these disciplines when practiced in the UK. He's written and lectured extensively in the UK, Sri Lanka, and Canada on issues of race and culture in psychiatry, and latterly on mental health development in the Third World. In 2000, Suman was awarded the National Black Mental Health Achievement Award and sponsored by the King's Fund and Mind Millennium Awards. And in 2011, the Lifetime Achievement Award for Culture, Race and Mental Health by the University of Toronto, in association with the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, Centre for Diversity in Counselling and Psychotherapy, for his academic achievements. His books include Cultural Diversity, Mental Health and Psychiatry, The Struggle Against Racism, Mental Health, Race and Culture, Mental Health Worldwide, Culture, Globalization and Development, Institutional Racism in Psychiatry and Clinical Psychology, Race Matters and Mental Health, and most recently co-edited Global Psychologies, Mental Health in the Global South. Further details can be found on his website at www.sumanfernando.com.
Yes, thank you, Will. Thanks for introducing me. Is that it now? I'm on, am I?
Yeah, that's it. You take it away.
Yes, well, thanks for asking me to do this talk, and thank you for Vanessa and Andre and everyone else who's helped in getting it together. I agreed to do this on research, but when I came to think about it, it was much more difficult than I thought, actually, because I don't consider myself a researcher as such, and and when things about embedded racism embedded in the culture of mental health, psychiatry, psychology, it really, when you come to research as a social process, I see research very much as a social process, whether it's in chemistry or in psychiatry, wherever it is, it's researching, it's actually trying to find things out. We pose problems, we have theories that we call on to work out how we research. We have various methods that we've inherited mostly, and we look up the different methods. Then finally, the most important is the analysis for mental health. And perhaps it's in the analysis that racism really comes out, I think, in most mental health research, and put me off. But I just research. I did some research. I did the research for an MD, and ultimately I got the MD. It took ages, but it was on depression among Jews in the East End of London, where I was working at the time in the 60s. And this was, I asked various questions about, the current theories were about, at the time, this was way back, was about the Jewish mother and depression, causing depression, if you like. The statistics on depression was indicated that in countries, in areas where Jews were a minority, in fact, there were relatively high rates of depression. And in Israel, where Jews were a majority, the depression rates were the same as everywhere else. And there were sort of indications like this. So it was interesting. And I had really wanted to research something else, but this is I managed to get money, or my supervisor at the London managed to get the money for this, because, well, various other reasons. So what I want to say was, at the end, as I was doing this research, we had control groups. We had 4 groups: depressed Jews, non-depressed Jews, depressed non-Jews, and non-depressed non-Jews. These are all people actually in hospital for various reasons, either for for psychiatric reasons or for non-psychiatric, usually surgical patients who were sort of sitting doing nothing, waiting for the operations, as people used to do then, who had the time to answer my questions. But as I was talking, these were supposed to be samples which we'd agreed they were all people born in a particular part of the East End, and so they were controlled for background, and we ensured that they were controlled for age, etc., etc. But as I was talking to people, I realized that really these were not controlled groups at all. The experience that Jewish people had in their 20s, 30s, 40s, because they were people born in the East End, so they'd been there a long time, there was very different. Their backgrounds were very different. And this was because, ultimately, it's because of anti-Semitism. And and I read about, and I heard about, I knew about anyway. I should have known before, but I realized how important it was to consider racism when you consider culture. And ever since then, I've always questioned this. Whenever cultural studies are made, without considering the prejudiced views about the different cultures, different people, different kinds of people, etc., then really this is a useless bit of research. They are not actually as a control study. And so this applies, of course, to most of the schizophrenia studies, most of the studies in psychiatry, which drew my interest when I got interested in race issues in psychiatry. So that's a lesson I learned, but I got an MD out of it, I suppose. And this is what people stay in research for. I think some people do get very disillusioned what they're doing, but they stay in it because you want your qualifications, etc., etc. You've invested yourself in it. So that's my introduction. The only bit of good research, I mean, interesting and called useful research I did was when I went back to Sri Lanka in the 2007 to 2012, sponsored, it was a big research project supervised by the transcultural psychiatry people in Montreal. And it was about looking at how communities in different parts of the world exposed to trauma. It was psychological, it was trauma either from external events like tsunamis and floods and disasters, or trauma from caused by people in that country, civil wars. So this was one of 4 different countries we investigated. And there was to look at how people deal with trauma and then try to work out how best this can be done. And the main point of that exercise was also to look at outsiders coming in to help and what good they did or what complications they created. And, that sort of approach. It was about Western aid in underdeveloped countries, I suppose, how it's in psychiatry. Is it of any use at all? So I'll get on to my thing. I'll go through it very quickly. Now, the background to what we are faced with now here is the Atlantic slave trade, the wealth from that kick-started the revolution, the industrial revolution, the development of Europe, and the underdevelopment of many other countries because of colonization. So it was a development in one place and underdevelopment in others. And this was because of colonialism. But colonialism was a overpowering sort of system that didn't just take people's land and make money out of it, but actually had a very strong cultural influence, and we became westernized. I experienced a bit of the end of the political colonialism in Sri Lanka because I'm quite old, and so I think that that helped me to understand what these sort of presentations represent. And Western culture spread all over the world, and we've all become westernized in a way. And in terms of racism, I think we're all racist. We have been, our upbringing to greater or lesser extent embeds racism in our own minds, whether we are, whatever color we are, whatever race we claim to be, or what other people think we are, etc. And European culture, and then psychiatry. Psychiatry is another big problem, really, to research, I think. And madness, how madness became mental illness and got absorbed into the culture, social cultural system of the West. And then we made up psychology and psychiatry as a way of helping in developing mental health services. You might see it like that. And this was all done in a very racist framework of Western domination culture. And of course, using local people, like my father was a doctor, using me, everyone else, in a way, in the process. But it was our systems of psychiatry, psychology came about, of course, there was the European Enlightenment that fed into how these systems developed. But the Enlightenment had very good aspects about it, of course, but it was in racism. Racism was embedded again in Enlightenment work. Many of the Enlightenment people like Hegel, Kant, Jung were very made very great racist remarks all the time in what they said. So one would say they're racist. But also, of course, there's this background of racism, the history of psychiatry and psychology were developed during this period. And for instance, diagnosis, you look at the top bit, that's in a way how we make diagnosis, which, we can say is reasonable for the times when it was created. But we never considered the lower part, the culture in which this was done, all the ideologies, the assumptions, the views about people, about the races of people, etc., cultures fed into this. And really, when you come to think about it, embedded in in the system of diagnosis. And in developing it, we ignored non-European knowledge. That's the big thing. We completely ignored. I speak of we because I'm dual citizen, Asian, Sri Lankan, and British white, I suppose, because I've got my credentials from being black. When I came, I was black, and now I'm mostly white, I think, really, in some way in terms of ideology, except for my skin color, which of course means I can never escape it completely. Like the Jews escaped and the various other communities have escaped. How the Irish became white in America is a very good book to read. How the Irish became white, how the Jews became white. There's written a lot about that in America, but even here. But we ignored the Arabic, the psychiatry in the 10th to 14th century, we ignored everything's going on in the East. We ignored the various healing systems, lots of very complicated and very effective systems in pre-Columbian America, Africa, Asia. Very quickly, Islamic medicine, had about 300 years, actually even more longer than our asylums lasted. Tibetan medicine. There isn't a lot of writing on this, but there is enough for us to work with in order to, because a lot of the writing, for instance, on Islamic medicine is in Arabic, and much of it was burnt by the Inquisition during the wars between the Arabs and between the Muslims and the Christians, as they were called. They were called at the time. What we now need is decolonization. That's the basis of saying why we need decolonization. And we have to draw on ethnopsychiatry, the sort of things that are similar to psychiatry in various other cultures, and the global psychologies, what are now called indigenous psychologies, which I prefer to call global psychology, because these words get a pejorative connotations, and indigenous psychology, like the word black. When I came, it was a term of abuse. You were black. You didn't want to be called black. Wasn't a nice thing. But of course, after Black Power changed the meaning of that term, I was very, very proud of being black. Now, of course, I'm BMA or BAMA or I don't know, ABME or something. Well, psychiatric research. Research into cultural racial issues recently largely been a matter of studying single samples or matched samples of people from different ethnic groups resident in a particular location, and always using the census definition of ethnicity. What is that? So census definition, I was there when, I was here in this country when there were the arguments, discussions about monitoring. And it was created for monitoring, to get a rough idea of how services are used by different groups of people. And it wasn't about identity at all. And to call the census ethnicity an indication of people's identity in a psychological sense, or in a sense of race, racial identity, it doesn't stand up to that, and it can't be taken for that. So there's the first fault of creating sample errors. There's no cross-cultural relevance is negligible in international studies. For instance, one finds, especially to study illness. This is not about identity. And people have written about, what's wrong in our epidemiological studies, do the same thing over and over and keep up with saying, black people have more schizophrenia, white people have more depression, I don't know, yellow people have something else, I'm not sure what they have. But there are all sorts of things like this that we found out very interesting, and gives a lot of work for more researchers and for people writing books like me. And, we make a living out of it to some extent. But researchers are unwilling to or unable to question the methodology or to test out hypotheses that may question dogmatically held ideologies. For example, the notion that research is inherently race-free, that's the dogmatically held ideology. That when you say research is scientific, it's nothing to do with race or culture or no bias about it. We exclude biases, etc. There's nonsense, really. All research is biased, I think. It's a matter of good research would try and minimize this to an absolute extent. And in psychology, we just have not even tried to minimize this, because we don't even think it exists in terms of race and culture. And some examples of the Eastern study, I've mentioned my Eastern study. So there's a, it didn't allow for the backgrounds of people to be considered in terms of discrimination, in terms of how one has a background. My background, is very influenced, and we all are, by the way we live, where we live, the neighbors are people we live with, the schools we go to, everything else. It's not just, where you live. Piece of study and security, as I'll mention in a minute, biased concepts. Again, I'll rush on, I think. Token blacks, and this is a thing that comes up time and again in schizophrenia studies, because they were criticized for not having black people doing the research. And so we had many studies. If you read my book, you'll probably see examples of these, of token black person. I know a black woman was involved in the sort of gold standard study of schizophrenia and race, which is quoted. And it's, she was so, it drove her up the wall actually. And she left the whole field of research, and she became a black pastor, completely disillusioned with science. But we shouldn't be disillusioned with science. Science isn't the fault of science. It's about the fault of us using scientific models where it's not suitable, etc. And Eurocentric diagnosis. This sort of research could lead to racist action being taken. The example I give is the ESOP study. It shows the usual thing. If you're black, you're schizophrenic about 8 times, etc., 7 times. Their conclusions was it's not their genes, it's not genetic. We're not racist, as they put it. We don't think genetics has anything to do with this. It's not our diagnosis, of course, because we've got all these. We go according to the standard text in which are well accepted by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, by the professional bodies. We go according to those diagnoses, how to make those diagnoses. So it must be their cultures. Their cultures are, something wrong with their cultures. And the social engineering was, this got into The Guardian, and that's where I got involved with others. We wrote a letter, we took it up at the time, Guardian, that they were going to do a social engineering project run by the Health Star, the mental health star at the time, for 2010. He said it'll be done in 2010. It wasn't done, partly because it was, the whole notion was regarded as racist. And the government probably realized it. But I notice now that there's a project has been funded very much like it. Perhaps the government is now changing. Those other references. I've given references for all this so you can look them up. And of course, my book does refer to most of what I say. So anti-racism is not about being against white people or discarding everything that's Western. There's been a lot of good things happening in the West. There's a lot of good people who are white. There's a lot of bad people who are black. It's racist really to think of groups of people being different in every way because they have a different color or different background or different heritage. So decolonizing is not about throwing out all knowledge either, but of universalizing, of drawing together a mental health system, mental health theories that are drawn from a variety of sources, of all cultures, you might say, of all parts of the world. It would mean subtracting and adding. It's above all, it's reforming psychiatry and psychology. Some things are now considered decolonization incorrectly, I think. For being culturally sensitive, you say, oh, well, that's the same, you know. In fact, the Royal College recently, when we were challenged as to whether about their new curriculum, the answer was, oh, we've culturally sensitized that. We've decolonized that because it's now culturally sensitive. Famous, well-known psychiatrist some years ago said, you know, Black people are more aggressive, so we have to take that into account when we do our work, when we do our psychotherapy or give them medication. They're inherently, well, you know, if the assumption is racist, I don't know how cultural sensitivity can. And there are lots of other examples, but also generally cultural sensitivity is not about being anti-racist. Decolonization is the same as being anti-psychiatry. Well, it's not. It's actually reforming psychiatry and psychology. It's the same objection that was raised about Lang's movement, and many critical movements in psychiatry have been destroyed by the establishment bodies because saying they're anti-psychiatry, anti-psychology, anti-this or anti-that. That's a sort of common way of destroying something you feel is undermining your own sort of ideologies. Medicalizing distress is Western, people say. Well, you know, most of people, in fact, I thought that initially when I was studying this. You know, Eastern and Western, in the East, we don't medicalize problems. We see them in social, spiritual, various terms like this. But the medicalizing is done everywhere in various ways. It's in the Eastern, you get the medicalizing certain problems in Ayurveda into illness, and it's not stat. I think I'm running short of time. Let's see. How to pronounce it? Kijano's work is quite important, quite useful as a starting point for discussing and exploring how decolonization to take place. And people who fund research, who look at how the research is being done, perhaps diversity, of course, you know, ethnic, gender, various other diversities are useful, but beware of tokenism, particularly when it comes to race. You know, you can get Black people who have difficulty getting jobs anyway, and who have difficulty in establishing their credentials. I've seen this happen many times, and it nearly happened to me, I think, as well. Perhaps it did. You know, when someone offers you a prestigious sort of research project, if you were to join in, you take it because, you know, it gives you kudos, it's in your self-interest. So racism often is about self-interest, actually. Why we are racist is often when we even in fact know it is something like being racist, it's because of self-interest. So it happens to Black people, white people. Yes, there are certain things you want to be on the lookout for the thought of research that certainly refers to race, racism, culture, decolonization. Well, there's a yes, you need to be aware of. where differences between ethnic and cultural groups are being compared. I mean, ethnic monitoring, what you say when you're asked what ethnicity are you, you've got to choose one or the other. I mean, that's not about identity at all. Culture is to some extent about identity, and you have to work out a way of actually looking at different cultural groups in terms of a clearly defined and very meaningfully defined use of the word culture. International studies is another big area. It's much more complicated and almost very difficult area to do research in, I think, in mental health, because to start with, the whole meaning of mental is different in many other cultures to the Western help-seeking practices, service provision, observer bias. And decolonizing, look at the details through an anti-racist lens. After you study people deciding whether to fund something, need to know something about racism and coloniality of power, colonial thinking, quality of being colonial. Have the researchers got a handle on this? Do the researchers understand the modern use of the term culture and race? I mean, culture is not just something that you inherit, you just inherit. You inherit certain parts of it, but you also make culture yourself. We make culture ourselves, especially in multicultural societies. We are changing all the time into taking bits from here and there and adding these together and becoming different. As I said, if you see culture and race as in a way connected, from being black, I've become white to some extent, to a great extent. And this is because I was referring to using the word white as a sort of cultural, because that's how the monitoring people use it, isn't it? For monitoring, I think quite rightly. All the others are defined in culture, but or where you come from. But you're white, you're white. It's white versus Asian, Black, African, Caribbean, Chinese. White is white. That is, this is where we started. When I came to this country, I didn't know why I was Black, but I accepted that, and I was proud of it later on. And it was it's sort of something wrong with this. Exactly how matching is done, how ethnic diversity in groups of researchers allow for power considerations. Say, well, we've got a diverse group, and well, who has the power? Groups don't all work in one coherent sort of system. There's always a sort of balance. And of course, analysis. Are the researchers qualified to analyze the results from an anti-racist perspective? And then the analysis itself. Take on board. Need to see, when I first realized that psychiatry was racist was when patients I was talking to, because I got interested in why I was diagnosing them as schizophrenic. When I said, well, why do you think he said, well, it's racism, doc. It's like slavery. I remember that so well. I think most times I would have dismissed this, but it struck me because, how people feel, the experience. You go to a job and you're not given the job. You're given various good reasons, or objective reasons for why you were not qualified to do the job. But it was racism. The experience is actually important. Carry out, and then you do the sort of analyses that I have tried to do very inadequately and very limited way of a social historical exploration of dismantling, of how we can dismantle the master's house, how we can universalize the knowledge base. You take an anti-racist approach, the anti-racist lens, explore narratives. What really happened in this? A lot of my books, or what helped me in writing the book was that I felt I was able to give narratives. Say, well, this is what it's really happened. And of course, research in psychiatry research really has a function in researching alternatives, pluralistic systems. That's internationally research, global scene. And I have rushed through that. I've exceeded my time, I'm afraid. Well, as I always do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Suman. It's really, really interesting. And yeah, we're pretty much on time, so that's absolutely fine. Thank you very, very much for taking us through all of that. We've had some really good discussion that's been going on whilst you've been speaking as well. You'd be happy to know. And also some resources that are being shared in the group chat as well, which is really great. So keep those coming as well. Next in our program, we're going to hand over to our panel for some responses on what's been said. So I'm just going to hand over to Huma and Liv, and if I can just make contact with you from in here. I'm not sure if you're able to speak or turn your camera on.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just going to introduce you to our audience, and then I can let you provide your response and feedback. So this is Huma Andli. She's currently a PhD student at UCL and was previously a senior mental health researcher at McPin, using her lived experience to inform the research she works on. She uses her own experiences of navigating mental health research spaces as a South Asian woman of colour, as well as her social media platforms and networks, to explore the topic of decolonising mental health research and ensuring that research is diverse and inclusive, but also a welcoming and nurturing place for Black and non-people of colour who wish to pursue, progress and thrive within the mental health research field. She's also interested in exploring research practice and methodologies through a race lens.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, hi guys, really great to be here today with so many people joining, and thanks Professor Suman, that was a really great talk. And I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the things that I was thinking whilst Suman was talking, and from my personal perspective as someone with lived experience and someone who works within the mental health research field. And I wanted to start off by talking a bit about the methods of research that we use and how they could be dismantled a bit, or even just taken apart to think about how they contribute to racism within mental health research. And something that I've been thinking about for quite a while is how we report statistics within research in terms of representation of the research that we do. And I discussed this with quite a few colleagues about how we clump different ethnicities together to make research look more significant, and what that actually means for the individuals who've taken part in the research. So an example would be grouping together all people who are Black into one group as Black, but within that there would be Black African, Black Caribbean, and then mixed Black Caribbean with other ethnicities as well, and what that means and how them individual perspectives are clumped together, and then what that means for the research that we've been doing. So if we look at even within the Asian category, you might have Chinese, Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, but the different ethnicities within that have very different perspectives, and they might be first generation, second generation, British, might have been born here, but even within the Chinese ethnicity and the Bangladeshi ethnicity, for example.
Is ethnicity important, I think?
Is it?
Yes. What's the meaning of ethnicity?
what is the meaning of? Well, I think that's what I mean. What does it show us, and when we report it, what does it tell us about the people who have taken part in the research? So someone from Bangladesh doesn't necessarily mean that everyone else from Bangladesh will have the same experience. So what are we actually attempting to report by talking about ethnicity and when we're reporting it?
I think I mean, my comment would be to the pressure to report on ethnicity and not on culture or on race is a European is a master's scheme to actually break up, if you look at politically, any tendency to people to meaningfully get together. And I think ethnicity was created. I think these things, culture, see, race has been going on a long time. If you look into the history, race started, way back in really the present race thing started in the Atlantic slave trade times. And the culture came much later. Culture came in the 30s, 40s, 50s in Europe. And it sort of trumped, the two are very mixed up together. But if you're thinking of people's experience, you're trying to relate people's experiences as being people, as being an individual, if you like, in terms of the illness they develop. Then you have to work out with how you measure that experience. So in fact, white people might have very similar experience to other Black people. Yeah, and Bangladeshis. I mean, I was called Black when I first came, and I took that on. I think perhaps I shouldn't have, but I did, and it took me on a particular journey where I developed very strong feeling for African Caribbean men and people. And that's been a lot of my work has been about why are they despised and why are they diagnosed as schizophrenic. And then you look at what is schizophrenia, how do we diagnose schizophrenia, and how do we conceptualize it in our theories. They are very racist theories. When you look into it. It comes, well, in a way, it's connected to drapetomania, which you may have heard of. It's connected to the illnesses of slaves, and it's there's why schizophrenia has become a black disease. In that book, you get some indication of it. You can follow that up with other work. So it's actually choosing your samples and what you call them is important.
I do think it holds. I do think there is a place for it when we're talking about representation within the workplace, so within the research field. So if we talk about recruitment and ensuring that the workplace is diverse and that staff represent the people who you're conducting the research with and for, because even myself, I've experienced being in a research environment where I felt uncomfortable even just working with completely white populations and conducting research in that way. And so, and there's also something about retention of people of non-white people within the research field. So we always talk about ensuring that research is done with and for the people that we're doing it with, but there isn't as much conversation about having researchers of color who represent the participants. And then when we talk about white researchers who are going in and doing research with people of color communities, there's a problem there, because when we, for example, collect qualitative research, for example, if we do interviews or observations, there's always a racial lens there that we might not always acknowledge, but from my point of view anyway, it's always there. And then when we come to analysis, it might be then further ignored. So when we then analyze, for example, transcripts of interviews, we will theme interviews, we'll theme observations, etc. And we won't ever have to, probably won't have time, but even if we did want to do it, we don't ever think about how that's been interpreted.
I'm really talking about a very fundamental difference in how we choose. More for monitoring, for a large ethnicity was created for monitoring, to find out whether people are, on the whole, being represented in a similar proportions. And it's not about the identity, which psychologists, psychiatrists are really working about on identity, how people feel themselves in a particular community. And that is, you have to actually derive the measures. And none of the psychiatric research, psychology research, well, a few psychology researchers do, but psychiatry research. But because we've got ethnicity and ethnic monitoring, and we've got the tick boxes there, you can ask people to tick which box you are in. We use it, but it's not relevant. It's not relevant to psychiatric psychology research, which are dealing with individuals who have varying experiences and have been discriminated against in various ways, or not discriminated against, or have privileges. So you can look at people who have privileges, people who don't. These sort of differences, you can have a whole, it becomes much more complicated and it's more difficult. It's much easier to pick something out of the box of the,
Suman, I'm just going to pass back over to Huma just to let her finish on this. It's really interesting to hear you guys discuss this. We're going to have a big discussion at the end too. Thank you very much for that, Suman. Huma, is there anything else that you wanted to add to your reflection overall of what Professor Fernando said in his presentation?
Yeah, I guess I just finished with kind of considering, how do we dismantle this and how do we move forward from here, because it's been hundreds and hundreds of years of this going on. And so when we talk about decolonizing, how do we dismantle it? Because we have to consider how many people have suffered as a consequence of the way psychiatry and psychology research is done. So how do we flip that around and make sure that people aren't, mainly Black people, but also non-Black people of color, aren't discriminated against within research, and also to a point where they benefit off research the way white communities do, and the way research should be beneficial to everyone. I think it's complex, and I think it's really complex and multifaceted, like Suman said, but I think, and there's a lot of questions that I don't have the answer to, but yeah, I guess on reflection, it makes me think how much we need to do to flip this over, because it's been years of this happening, and essentially means us unlearning everything that we've been doing and thinking of it through a completely different lens, to ensure that everyone benefits the same way. And for me, that's making sure that the spaces are safe, especially in the workplace. Spaces are safe for people to thrive and do well. And yeah, I agree with Suman about it being ethnicity being a monitoring purpose, but I think for quite a lot of people it is part of their identity. Like for me, being able to say that I am British Pakistani is really important for me, it kind of gives me a place of belonging. And for me, it's something of pride, actually, when it hasn't been in the past. But for some people it is. I mean, I think actually for a lot of people it is part of their identity, that they feel they should be able to share, even if the consequences are negative. We don't, sometimes it's easier to put everyone in a box, but I think we have a lot of similarities, but sometimes the differences are what make us unique. So yeah, I guess I'd end there.
Huma, thank you very much for all of that. That's really interesting. And like you say, there's seems to be so many problems, and they seem to have gone on for so long. It's certainly unclear the best ways that we can think to kind of begin to rectify a lot of these. So obviously we are looking for, in addition to the discussion today, looking for suggestions on the Padlet, which Andre has shared in the chat. So if you are sitting there listening and thinking that you have some solutions, then feel free to go there and to add those as well. I'm going to hand over now to our second member of our kind of reflection panel, Grace. So if I can try and make contact with you, Grace, are you able to turn your camera and microphone on?
I'm on, yes.
Hello, hi Grace.
Hi.
I'm just going to introduce you and then I'll let you give your thoughts. So this is Grace Lucas. She's an academic writer and yoga teacher. At age 18, Grace was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. 10 years later, she published a best-selling account of her experiences, Thin, and spoke in media, educational and medical settings about her recovery journey. After the birth of her 2 children and inspired by the process of writing an illness narrative, Grace completed an MSc in medical humanities. Partly driven by her own lived experience of developing bodily awareness through yoga, which vastly improved her mental well-being, Grace then undertook a PhD where she explored the relationship between embodiment and mental health. After some years working as a qualitative researcher in the health sciences, Grace is now a lecturer in mental health and society at City, University of London. Her research interests center on embodiment and embodied methodologies for understanding and researching mental health and well-being.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And thank you very much, Professor, for your fascinating presentation, and to Hummer as well for her reflections. I guess the things that I wanted to pick up on very much relate to perhaps what I've done or tried to do in my role as a lecturer. So quite practical in a sense. I guess I'm very much kind of indebted and inspired by one of my PhD students, Alia Sheikh. Alia is conducting some qualitative research as part of her PhD into Muslims' experience of pregnancy and birth in the UK. And it was a point in the journey where we came to reflect on the different methodological positions that she could take. And I, as a kind of experienced researcher in health sciences, began, I guess, to come up with some accepted typical models and methods. I think someone used the word inherited methods. I think also Suman reflected on these ideas of ideologies and scientific paradigms which are passed down. And as you kind of initiate yourself into academic culture, and for me, coming from kind of a creative background and a humanities background, and then moving into health sciences and exploring mental health within that kind of discipline, I was aware of kind of becoming, I guess, more immersed in the way in which medical and health research is conducted and is in this hierarchy of evidence, and how those hierarchies of evidence that we use within healthcare reflect other hierarchies which exist in the world. And as I began to explore these kind of ideas with these kind of philosophical positions that Alia might use, and we discussed them, we began to reflect on, or she began to reflect on, how it wasn't really possible to use these methodologies, for example, where one brackets oneself off from one's research. And that became something that I started to think about, that if your, for example, if your faith system, if your religion, if your value system is very much who you are, you bring that with you to your research. And I think I was able to make some connections there with Alia because of my interest in embodiment and my interest in how we bring our embodied experience of being a body in the world, a body that may be accepted or not accepted, a body that is every day kind of reacting and responding to the way the world treats it. That's going to come into your position as a researcher. And and how it becomes, in a process of being a lecturer anyway, I feel my responsibility, and I do take it personally. I think that's quite a good way of thinking about it. I take it personally that if I'm just passing down things to my students because they are kind of validated paradigms or models that we take as the kind of the pinnacle of what makes robust research, we are just kind of replicating positivist biomedical frameworks that perhaps do not reflect our positions and worldviews. And that was something that I reflected on as well, because I was able to bring my own embodied experience of having seen psychiatrists, been a patient, and in a sense having my embodied reality somewhat kind of cast aside in favor of discussing rational and irrational thinking. That's kind of where I saw that psychiatry focused. And so what I felt I could do practically to kind of to advance my understanding in this area, and because Alia had such great ideas and I'd done a lot of work on decolonizing methodologies and reading up on it, is I decided I could use my I wouldn't say the word power, but as a lecturer, I have a role within my department and my school that we could set up together a joint group to reflect on decolonizing methodologies, and we could think within that about the impact of colonialism on thought, research, and academia. We could consider structural and systemic issues. We could think about what Suman was talking about in terms of starting with methodology, starting with asking questions around what is decolonizing, what does that mean, and starting to bring together a group of interested colleagues. And I think for very many people who are used to kind of operating in health research, in very kind of biomedical paradigms with those frameworks and evidence hierarchies, the ones that I teach my students about, that we think about as kind of layer the importance of different sort of models of research. Sometimes we just don't take time to stop and listen and to stop and reflect. We're at this culture of productivity, of writing grant applications, of just doing things so quickly. And I think that this is very hard work for people to do. And one thing that helped me was Brené Brown talked about how the lens with which we see through, and it's actually something that Suman talked about as well, the norms through which we see and perceive the world are so rooted in this Western culture that they are soldered, is what Brené Brown says, to our face. And that became quite a powerful metaphor for me as well. You know, how can we then take the perspective of others? And Brené Brown says it's about believing people's experiences as they tell them to us. We don't, she says, run those experiences through our own lenses and thereby dismiss other people's experiences and other people's truths. But actually taking a step back, for many people, they don't even realize that the lens is soldered to their face. And I guess, especially when it comes to research, being trained, being kind of being a researcher kind of in academia, trying to gain more and more knowledge, we kind of use these inherited methods and move forward with them. We cite, we reference, we replicate established models, and those are necessarily the models which have most power and most influence. And actually, we also use established frameworks and established kind of checklists which tell us that our research is technically good. But I think that this is a big part of the problem. We just do not stop to think, we replicate, we cite to embed ourselves in the academy, to show ourselves as good researchers. And in my relationship with Alia, I was almost passing that on until she made me stop and think. And it then made me reflect upon my own embodied knowledge and how we must bring that into our research. And once we understand that we have this soldered lens to our face, one which is of dominant white male, rationalist, empirical, objectivist kind of ways of viewing the world, we can then start to just stop passing that on, just stop replicating that, and start to just pause and have a conversation. So I'm certainly not an expert in the way that Professor Suman is, but I just take responsibility for that as somebody who is teaching other researchers and teaching. I also teach healthcare professionals, I teach nurses, about research methods and about biopsychosocial models of understanding health and illness and mental illness. So I take that as something that is my job to try and kind of start those conversations. If I have a power as a lecturer to set up a group and to bring those voices in from students, from people of colour who can come and contribute much better than I can about their own lived experience, if I can listen to those experiences and understand that I may not be able to see through that exact lens myself, but that I acknowledge that truth and I listen to that truth, then that's really where I feel I can start to be a part of the conversation. So it may seem a little theoretical, but I guess to me, it does start with questioning those paradigms, those models, those methodologies, to really kind of stop and pause before we keep replicating what we have done.
Yeah, so that's I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it touches a little bit on some of what has been said in the chat, and of course what Professor Fernando mentioned in his presentation as well, about this idea of reform versus kind of complete revolution, as it were. So I wonder, Grace, what do you think about that? Do you feel like we need to have a revolution, or do you feel like there's more of a subtle reform that's required?
I think I'm a little bit of a revolutionary kind of person, but I get a little bit frustrated that when, for example, in my PhD, I said, what do we mean by the mental in mental health? Because, and as Professor Fernando said, that means different things around the globe. To me, it's a problem in itself because it reinscribes dualism, and that dualism between mind and body, between mental and physical, reflects other dualisms that we have. So I'm a little bit of a revolutionary in terms of thinking we need to reassess much of the language that we use. And I do think that language is incredibly powerful. And I think that's where, thankfully, kind of coming from a humanities background and as a writer, I'm able to see and kind of try and interrogate that. When I don't know, I guess I feel like we need to do more than put our heads together, as it were, as the charity suggests, and think more about what we can more and although that's incredibly challenging to do that. So yeah, I don't necessarily have the answer, but I think I do feel that, you know, radical means from the roots, doesn't it? And I think unless we grab this by the roots, we're only ever dealing with the surface.
That's a really good analogy. And Huma, do you have any thoughts on that at all, about whether or not we should be completely bringing up all the roots, or whether or not we can kind of do some modifications on the system?
I completely agree with Grace. I think we do need to tackle it from its roots, but I would add that for a lot of people, saying that will be really daunting and feel like, oh God, I have to forget everything I've ever known, and, you know, like change everything that I do, and like, am I racist? Not like I'm doing everything wrong. So I think in terms of that, I think we need to be really careful about the language that we use, in that, you know, we're not pulling everything out and just throwing it away and coming back and starting again. There are some really good things about about the stuff that we do. We just need to make sure that it's beneficial to everyone and that everyone is getting something out of it. And that includes, you know, jobs, that includes people benefiting from the research, people benefiting from participating in research involvement and everything. So I don't think it's just like slight modification. I think it will be something major, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be something that we've got to do every single day in the work that we do and think about every single day. And then that's how the change will come about, in, you know, analyzing, deconstructing, and reconstructing the way we do our work.
And Professor Fernando, I think in your presentation you kind of mentioned that it was more of a reform that was required rather than a revolution. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, I think I was looking at the sort of the bigger picture of the world, maybe to sort of going too far there. But I mean, the cultures, races, these are breaking down really, and people say the world is becoming smaller in some way. Certainly in Western countries, the divisions of culture is becoming much more fluid, as someone put it. You know, there's a fluidity of culture, and I sort of dramatized it somewhat by saying, you know, I started by being black and now I'm white. But in a way, that's a sort of a feeling that is there, I think, in the social sciences too. That we have to keep up with what the world is becoming, whether we like it or not. We are not in separate silos anymore. It's all breaking up, breaking down, you might say, and new sort of groups are being formed. There's a lovely book called Afropeans by a guy who a British Muslim, I think, British anyway, British guy who went to Europe for about 2 years doing sort of research. And he was researching how ethnicity, what we call ethnicity, is being formed. Different groups of people are being formed. Because of course, in mainland Europe, there's much more immigration and much more variety than here. And so there's that he coined the term Afropean, that there are people who are from Afghanistan, from Mexico, from European countries, from Romania, from Latvia, who are forming, are together becoming cultures, I'd say. There's a sort of cultural world.
Yeah.
The ethnicity is going that way. And, so that I think if we look at that, I think it's not a complete revolution, and it's not a completely going along with what we have. I think we need to, in psychiatry, psychology, we need to see compromises, you might say. You know, we need to see ways of coming together, of East and West, South and North, black and white, you know, coming together in the psychiatry field, a sort of a universal psychiatry, if you like, doesn't exist.
Can I add to that? Sorry.
That's really, I come, you know, we have, I was struck by Huma and Grace taking very different sort of polarities, and maybe I was not putting it so well, but I was thinking of a common ground between the two. And we have to find this common ground in psychology and psychiatry.
Absolutely. Homer, have you got a point you want to make?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Suman was saying about us all working together. And a point I was going to make earlier was in terms of like the communities that we work with and how we work with them, in terms, like, do we go in and just have this white savior complex and say, well, this is how you do this and this is how you do that, and if you do this you'll benefit, and this is, if you do this you'll feel better? Are we having this equal ground where we're allowing people to share their thoughts and what they do and what works for them, instead of us saying, well, no, you need to throw everything away, we're from the global south, you do things this way, and that's not what this diagnostic manual says, or that's not what we've been taught. So I think there needs to be some common ground in like learning from each other across like Western psychiatry and Eastern and, you know, the whole world, and you know, not having this kind of power dynamic of, well, we're from the global south, so we know how to do everything best, because we don't. So yeah, that's just what I was going to add.
Let me just say, I think that's what colonialism did. It divided people up, actually, in a way. It also united people, but it divided people up by sort of imposing the race that, one race is better than another. It was really through racism that colonialism did this. And racism came from the Atlantic slave trade, where that was needed for economic reasons, or that was needed by people in power, the dominant groups, for economic reasons. They had to have black people who did the work and white people who got the knowledge, actually had the time to develop the knowledge, as well as develop their countries. And we have to be liberated from colonialism. This is how I see decolonization. Excuse me, of psychiatry and psychology as a liberation from the domination that colonialism imposed.
There's just another point I want to move on to, because it's something that I feel you both kind of touched on, is this idea of clumping to get people together or separating people out. We've had a question from another student at Liverpool who has asked, and it kind of touches on a little bit of what you were discussing before. So it's just, how do you feel about the term BAME in the context of racism and mental health? Does it facilitate bias, and is the grouping of people in this way appropriate? So I don't know, Huma, do you want to come in on that, because you were discussing that before?
I don't know. I don't really like the term BAME personally, and I think it is because I think clumping together everyone within the BAME category is quite dangerous, because I was just reflecting on, on what I said earlier about having representation within the research field, and in terms of like recruitment and researchers. And something I was going to say was that me being someone who's South Asian and a woman doesn't mean that I can speak on behalf of everyone else. And I think someone mentioned this in the chat earlier as well, because even within the BAME category, I can't speak on behalf of everyone who's BAME. And obviously within, like, as a South Asian woman, I'm really aware that there's anti-Blackness in the South Asian community. So even myself as a South Asian researcher, going in and doing research on a population of majority Black people wouldn't be right, because we're all in this BAME category. So in that sense, it wouldn't be beneficial at all to the Black community. And so that's why I think there needs to be representation for everyone, so that everyone feels that they, can share and can get involved in research in some way or the other. So I'm speaking from the perspective of within mental health research, I don't think BAME is good at all. And even when we're reporting on research, saying BAME versus white is clumping together quite a lot of people who, there's probably more similarities within some groups of BAME and white people than there is within that whole category of BAME, which is why I don't think it's beneficial. But I understand why it's used to make things easier, but making things easier doesn't benefit most people. So I think we got to move away from making things easier for the minority, because the majority suffer as a consequence. So that's my take on it.
Grace, we haven't heard from you on this. Have you got any thoughts at all?
I think generally I feel uncomfortable with that term, but I'm not in that group. I mean, I have to acknowledge myself. I'm a white person from the northeast of England, and I don't know what it feels like to be labelled like that, because I am not in a minority. And I think that there's a problem with it being used as a kind of othering. It feels to me like actually it's from the stance of this country. Actually, many of those people are in a majority in other parts of the world, but it's kind of it's a label, it's an othering.
They're not the same people. They're not the same people who are the majority.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. so yes, I think what I was just trying to say is it feels like a label put on people, and maybe who are very different, and it's very difficult when you then perhaps use that as example. You know, I think speaks to Professor Fernando's point about tokenism sometimes within research, and trying to kind of say, well, we have this, we've covered that, or by kind of including this group of very diverse people. So I think it troubles me, but I'm not sure I'm qualified enough to speak on that.
If you know, the example I gave of the ESOP study, supposing that study, the two groups were mixed up together and people were divided into 2 or 3 different groups, depending on their experience of life over the last 10 years in their community, in wherever they lived, you know, wherever they were. And you divided people into different types of experience. And I think they would have come to some conclusions, some useful conclusions, perhaps, about what leads to schizophrenia. But instead of that, you started off by a sort of assumption that if you're Black, you're different, you have a different experience to white. Yes, okay. But there would be white people who also have similar experiences as those Black people. And there will be Black people who have similar experiences to white people. I mean, as a doctor, for instance, I'm become, you know, I get a lot of the privileges that white people get. I've got white privilege to a great extent, much more than many of my neighbors who are white in where I live, because it's a sort of mixed area. And this sort of class and various things come into this. So you have to give, if you're going to do research on people, you have to, in a multicultural society, you have to divide up your groups. You're looking at different groups, not in terms of this classification that was devised for monitoring, which I agree with. I think it's good that they have these, but it is for that particular purpose, not for psychiatric psychology research. That is what, so it's about the nitty-gritty of research I was talking about. To come together, you have to put people together and divide people up if you want to do that as different groups in different ways, not in terms of the ethnic classification, which is really a tick box exercise, most people. I mean, I put different, I put ticks against different things in different situations. Think, well, if I'm applying for a job, you know, what is best? I come as, if I put white, I mean, you'll think I'm deluded. I'll be sent to, I'll be classified, I'll be sectioned, not classified. This is a sort of, so you have to, you know, people do use these classifications. You know, I've got I know, family and grandchild, you know, who's white. Everyone says they're white, but he puts it down as mixed race because he's got a grandparent or great grandparent who was brown skinned, or he thinks he did. So because they were looking for mixed race people to give preference to. I mean, you know, it's that way. But mostly they're looking for white people, but you wouldn't say that. So it's you know, this sort of monitoring is a different thing. Don't get that mixed up with identity.
That's a really interesting discussion that's come out of this, and certainly something that I feel is something that needs to be resolved in some way. We've had a really good discussion here. We've had loads and loads of questions. I'm wary that we don't want to go on for hours and hours, but I know we could. Vanessa, are you quite happy to talk now, or would you rather we take any more questions? Or
I was going to suggest, because this is the first of several seminars, we're going to be able to pick up on these questions later. So I think it's probably best that we try and keep to time and let everybody get on with their evenings, because obviously dinner in the evening is beckoning. So I would suggest if that we will continue this discussion. It's why we wanted to do a series of 6 webinars, because we knew that this topic is very involved and you can't do it justice in an hour. So the whole reason for having the series is so that we can pick these things up. So the questions that you've put in the chat are not lost. We've created the Padlet so that we can continue to engage in this as well. And we will take all of these things forward. And I think I was just going to speak for a few minutes just before we close about the role of organisations. You know, I'm really grateful to everybody for being here tonight, and for Will for chairing us, because in this series of webinars, I was really mindful that, you know, what we're trying to look at is actions for change, and we've discussed it in the chat and among the Humo and Grace and Suman have been talking today about some of the, you know, deep-rooted issues that we face in mental health research. I've worked in mental health research for 25 years, and I feel a great responsibility as a leader of an organisation to be doing something about this. And so in this webinar series, we're going to be asking a different organisation to speak at each event. And as I was part of the organising committee, I got to go first. So I'm just going to speak really, really briefly. But I do think that it's really important that mental health research funders, professional bodies and charities can take part. So we have approached Mind, and they're going to speak at an event. The Centre for Mental Health are going to speak. We're in touch with funders such as Welcome, UKRI and MQ. So I just wanted to open up the importance of the organisation in mental health research, because obviously the mental health research ecosystem is really complicated, it's complex. And to drive forward change, as we've discussed, we need a radical culture shift. We need a radical shift in practice. And research, because research impacts on mental health practice, a lot of the questions in chat today have been about practices and the problems of underrepresentation of various different groups within different medical disciplines and mental health disciplines. And if research is really going to have impact, we've got to think about that translation from research to practice. We don't do research to write lots of peer review papers. I don't. We do it to change people's lives. So we think that we can improve the way in which we understand mental distress, the systems of support we might put around people when they're having periods of distress. So it's so important that research, we can create research that's going to lever a more humane and compassionate and fit for purpose mental health system. And just this week, we've had the white paper on the Mental Health Act published. And so there's so many problems within the system in which we are working with. So this webinar series sits very squarely and takes, straight up the fact that we've got a lot of systemic issues to deal with, and the role of the organisation is within that. So I felt that it was important to kind of reflect on what McPin is trying to do in this space. I don't have all the solutions, and we're learning, and that's part of the journey. But I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes just sharing with you some of the things that we're really trying to do. If you haven't come across McPin before, we're particularly interested in peer research and working in the public involvement space. So we employ peer researchers and we work with partners to shape mental health research agenda using experiential expertise. And I'm fortunate, because of this position in the charity, I chair the Alliance of Mental Health Research Funders and I attend national mental health research funder meetings. So this provides opportunities to take forward research and conversations around anti-racism. And that's what I've been trying to do over the past year, trying to really elevate the conversations and bring race into a lot more conversations that I'm having. McPin is 8 years old. And I would say as an organisation, we're really confident on working around mental health, creating good quality work and establishing wellbeing programmes for our staff, learning with and from others, how to develop methods for collaborative working in science. It's work in progress, we get things wrong, and we learn from all the time from our staff, supporters and the wider community. And last year we began to bring race much more focus into our conversations. We hadn't done that previously. We talked and thought about inequalities and inclusion, but we were wantful. We had not done enough to tackle racism in mental health. And after the death of George Floyd, our staff expects a lot more of McPin. like a lot of charities, we're on a journey, and staying with an anti-racism focus is our core objective. And we're trying to use our influence both to try and internally, so we're trying to use our influence in different ways, and we're trying to learn all the time. And we've been really fortunate that over the last 15 months, we've worked on a collaborative with Black Thrive. It just so happens that it's at this time in history that we had developed a partnership with Black Thrive. But I think as an organisation, we've learned a lot from them, and I think they've learned a lot from us, and that's part of the culture I think that we're trying to foster here, that trying to build these kind of collaborations. So we've been fortunate that we've brought race and whiteness really centre into a project and put a race lens into a piece of research that we've never done before, and we want to do that a lot more. We know that self-education is so important, and so one of the things that's important about this webinar series is sharing the resources, sharing podcasts, sharing poetry, sharing books that you've read, things that can help, that you found helpful, that other people might find helpful, so that we can all support each other on this journey. So within our organisation, we've been doing quite a lot around self-education and encouraging staff to use staff time to do that. So much of our work looks at peer knowledge and at the expertise that comes from experience, and we need to think about intersectionality in research and the experience of both. Somebody said in the chat about participatory action research, such a brilliant method. But across the whole mental health science discipline, we need to be thinking about intersectionality in RCTs, as well as all the other kind of different methodologies. And I feel that we're starting to do that and starting to have conversations with people around that. So my objective is to ensure that we keep working with diverse communities, we diversify PPI groups in our staff teams, we bring race equality impact assessments into studies, we think actively and deeply about the unintended consequences of our work, because a lot of our work has unintended consequences, and we need to think a lot more about that. So the things that I personally am doing, and as an organisation, our commitment to do more, is to keep the race conversation really prominent with my staff, with funders, with project partners, and also my own children. So just to end, the commitment from McPin for the next 12 months is to work with funders and academic partners to follow up on ideas emerging from this webinar. So I don't want you to feel that this webinar is just chat. We're all taking note of this, and I'll be talking to other people, and we'll be trying to bring, as I say, other organisations into this space so you can question them and you can question me too. We want to develop, McPin will be 10 years old next year, and we want to develop a new strategy based on COVID, based on our anti-racism work and the Black Lives Matter protests. What should McPin do going forward? What is our place in the mental health research space? We need to think about that, and we need a new strategy. And I want to develop our work internally on race and intersectionality. So there are three key things that I'm planning to do, and it's not me doing it, it's everybody within McPin. And as I said, our staff have really been pushing us to change, and that change I know that I'm growing as a leader through that, and I am looking at my whiteness, and I'm looking at my space in this whole area, and trying to think about how we can create a different sort of approach to mental health research. So thank you ever so much for spending the evening with us, or the early evening with us, and Will, thank you for hosting tonight. I hope you'll come back to one of our next webinars, and we'll be able to continue this conversation. If anybody has specific questions for me or McPin, please put them in the chat or get in contact with us, through the usual channels, because this is really about growth and development, and we're really keen to make sure that we do the best in the sector as a champion of mental health research and of lived experience expertise.
Well, thank you very much for that, Vanessa. It's really interesting to hear from the perspective here, if you talk from the perspective of the charity and what you're hoping to set a standard, really, and that's really sounds really great. Thank you all for being here. We're really excited about where we're going and things that we're talking about and we've talked about today. And thank you, of course, to Professor Fernando for talking this evening. We'd love to see you again, and to have you kick off the series that we're obviously doing on the back of being part of the webinar before. But also thank you to Hummer and to Grace, who have had to ad-lib, not knowing exactly what was going to be said, and we put you on the spot. And it's lovely to meet both of you in this strange virtual space. So thank you to everyone who's been here as well, participating in the discussion. and to those of you who obviously have just been present but listening, that's both on Zoom and those watching via the live stream. We will be sharing the recordings from today's session with you shortly, as well as the slides from Suman's presentation. Today's session was, of course, the first of a monthly series, How to be an Anti-Racist Mental Health Researcher. So please do join us for the second event, which is on Tuesday, the 9th of February at 5:30 p.m, where we'll welcome Professor Frankie Singh, Professor in Social Work at Royal Holloway, and Rihanna Walcott, PhD student and co-editor of the anthology The Colour of Madness. We also will share with you an open list of resources and links where we encourage you to add to, as well as the Padlet page, which we mentioned in the group chat, which is like an online notice board where you can share responses to the questions that have been posed there. If you'd like to be involved in future events in the series, either as a speaker or in another capacity, feel free to email us, which is livpsych@society.liverpoolguild.org. So thank you all again, once again, for taking part, and we hope to see you all again very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to end this for now, and